It's the biggest show of the summer. Kings of the West. Starring Bone Thugs and Harmony. E40. Too Short. Mac 10. The Dog Pound. DJ Quick. Sugar Free. And Khadijah. Live July 11th at Wells Fargo Arena. Don't miss Kings of the West with Bone Thugs and Harmony, E40, Too Short, DJ Quick, Mac 10, The Dog Pound, Sugar Free, and Khadijah. Get tickets now at HighVTix.com.
Iowa Fireworks Farm is Iowa's largest fireworks store. 6,000 square feet of hand-picked fireworks, over 50 brands, and 1,300 different products to choose from. But they're also family-owned and operated. Iowa Fireworks Farm is the one stop you need to make before July 4th. You'll find them just south of the Metro. Take I-35 to exit 43 at New Virginia. Head east and look for the Big Red Barn. At Iowa Fireworks Farm, the toughest part will be deciding what not to buy.
We recommend listening to the CW Pod with a glass of Steeple Ridge Bourbon. Grown, distilled, well-rested, and bottled in Erling, Iowa. Now from the Channel Seed Studios, this is the CW Pod, fueled by Steeple Ridge.
What up? June 10th, CW Pod here on Iowa Everywhere. We are presented as always by our friends at Steeple Ridge Bourbon. Go off and get yourself a bottle for the upcoming weekend of Steeple Ridge. I like the black label if you can find it. The white label is just fantastic too. The folks down in Erling, Iowa, the Hoffman family, they do a great job. And it's some of my favorite bourbon that I've ever had in my life. And I'm not just saying that because they sponsor the show. Really good stuff. You can find their bottles all over the great state of Iowa. So we thank Steeple Ridge Bourbon and all of our friends at the Lonely Oak Distillery for their sponsorship. We are in the Channel Seed Studios, and I have a guest this week. His name is Nate Boulton. He is an attorney. He is a former senator in the great state of Iowa. He is a former sports law professor, and he is going to help me sift through everything going on in college sports right now, where hopefully we can dumb some things down for an idiot like me. There's a lot of big words being tossed around right now with this House settlement. A lot of people don't truly understand it, myself included, and Nate is going to help us understand what it all means, where this thing eventually is going to go. Do we think this House settlement thing is a temporary deal, or could this be a permanent fix? What could be a permanent fix? I'm going to ask Nate all of those questions today. I also want to investigate with him the possibility, we just saw it come across Illinois today, for an increased state gambling tax. That is being tossed around a lot throughout the country. And we've seen it in North Carolina. Again, it happened with Illinois today. A lot of local governments are talking about this, and I presented that to Nate as a former senator. How could that conversation go if it is ever introduced in the state of Iowa? That, of course, being these sports gambling taxes, or it's not a tax, it's like a extra boost or whatever you want to call it, when it's a tax for sports bettors that would go to the athletic departments. So all that coming up. We're presented by Steeple Ridge Bourbon. Here's my conversation on this week's CW Pod with former Iowa Senator, attorney at law, sports law prof, Nate Boulton. Okay, well, you guys have heard me bloviate on all of this for way too long, for way too many years. Wanted to bring in an expert in this field, and he's former Iowa Senator Nate Boulton, an attorney who pays a lot of attention to this stuff. And I'm hoping, Nate, you can give us some context, because I'm very opinionated about a lot of this stuff. I'm just warning you right now. I think you and me are on the same side for what it's worth on most of it. But I'm hoping that you can kind of dumb a lot of it down for us, because this House settlement thing is like, I feel like it's been going on for like 10 years. And like, there's just so much minutia with all this, and I think you can be an asset to our audience. So first of all, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. And I'm really glad you didn't say you wanted clarity from me.
No,
There's not clarity on any of this. There hasn't been for about 40 years. And to your point, it's been about 10 years of rapid adjustment and change for a system that was broken in the 1980s. We had an amateur athletic model that was based on college students essentially going out for sports and making the varsity team as if it was still 1920, right? And when you had the big TV licensure deals starting to develop and really changing the landscape of putting a lot of money into this system focused straight on athletics, and then you saw coaching salaries increase dramatically, all kinds of new pressure points started to develop. And the absurdity of saying, okay, these athletes are frozen out from all of that money, but they're the actual product here, didn't make sense anymore. And so something had to happen. The NCAA, unfortunately, did nothing over and over again, ignored every warning sign, went to court over and over again with the same really bad arguments that didn't make sense anymore. And the courts continued to beat them up over it and give them countless warnings of, this is not going to be something we're going to allow you to continue to do because you've just always done it this way. This has to change. And so finally, the floodgates opened. Everybody really hated it when the floodgates really opened, and we had name, image, likeness collectives and open portals, and all of a sudden everybody's transferring everywhere all the time. It was just out of control. This starts to put some guide rails on things. Of course, it's a guide rail that favors the biggest money institutions. That's not going to be new to college athletics for anyone. I find it kind of amusing when people are surprised that, oh, this new system is only going to favor the biggest money schools. Okay, well, that was also the case in the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s. What we're going to continue to see, though, is new guardrails develop, new challenges develop, and get closer and closer to a system that preserves competition, but allows for essentially a market to exist that's freer and more real than we've had as an artificial market for years.
So can you do that, I guess, without the players being represented? Because that's what I keep looking at. Like, well, what's going to stop all these lawsuits? Because they're now you're going to say, well, you're capping our wages again. Like we're obviously worth more than that because they've been paying us that the last 3 years. How does this actually? It might be temporary, but does this actually stop this industry from evolving long term?
No, I think this is a temporary solution. I think you already have people saying, oh, we need an act of Congress to sort this out. We need a special exemption like baseball, originally developed that says, okay, this is a unique sport and unique set of circumstances. So we're going to exempt college athletics from the other laws. An act of Congress is really hard. Congress doesn't agree on anything. And to get something like this that doesn't have really a partisan issue to it is virtually impossible. This is not going to get resolved through Congress legislative action. So what is the only way in sports and economics that has ever really worked in this context? Collective bargaining agreements, where the players, the athletes, the employees are represented in a negotiated contract with their employer. And I think everybody cringes when they hear employee-employer relationship. Again, you have to look back and say, all right, at least in major college athletics, the big money sports, are we really talking about student athletes who are there pursuing their major and just happen to have gone out for a sport? Or are we talking about an equivalent of AAA baseball developing through the NCAA model and system? And it's been a long time since we've seen, the college sports be like the geology club on campus. That's not what this is. So all the handwriting is on the wall that these are closer and closer to employees every year, every step we take here. There's one way to do this the right way that kind of solves all these questions of competition and fair play and free market economics. And that is a collective bargaining agreement that says, here are your salary caps, here's your salary minimum, here are your trade deadlines or your transfer deadlines, here are the rules everybody's going to play by. And it's not one side telling the other side what the rules are, it's a negotiated agreement.
Yes.
The only way to get there is to have the players represented and the institutions represented. And that's what we see in Major League Baseball, in the NFL. That's how you get this type of agreement done. And so anything else that stops short of this is going to be more litigation and more change and more athletic directors doing what they ought to be doing, finding every workaround they can to have the best competitive advantage. And the same thing's going on, in every conference, and just everybody's doing the same thing, trying to figure out, okay, those are the quote unquote rules now. How do we get an advantage with them? And the end of the story is you really just have to have a collective bargaining agreement to do that.
So that's always been the thing. And then there's college sports fans loved it. Well, we need to have a commissioner who represents everyone. And that's not easy to do. Like the SEC and the Big Ten aren't just going to give up every advantage they've gained over 100 years just because for the sake of fairness.
Right.
With what we're talking about with collective bargaining, what are some of maybe we know that the schools don't want this and the conferences don't want this and the NCAA doesn't want this. Why do they not want this in layman's terms?
My opinion is because they fear the change, and they always have feared the change. And so they want as little change as possible to make this system work. And to me, every time you stop short of that change, you find new ways to break the system, and it's not going to work. I mean, the collectives, that wasn't a real thing, right? Like, I think we all look at that and say that wasn't some charitable organization finding ways to be involved in the community. It was essentially a workaround for pay to play to happen.
Yes.
And we saw, we saw haves and have-nots from that system. We saw, this House settlement is going to result in new haves and have-nots from a new system that has power conferences pretty easily able to make their number. Mid-majors are going to struggle to make their number. And you're going to see probably a really wide gap between low majors and high majors from here on out. That is going to worsen, right? At the end of the day, you just have to accept you no longer have the amateur athletic model. You haven't had it for years. You tried to freeze athletes in that system. You went way too long with that effort to freeze them. Now things are changing rapidly. I think the first indication, I used to teach sport law at Simpson College, and one of the years I was teaching that course was when the Northwestern students did try to unionize.
Yep.
And it was really telling to me the reason that case was resolved was not the federal government saying these are not employees, they're student athletes or they're amateur athletes. They said they didn't have jurisdiction over the dispute because too few institutions were private institutions in relation to the whole market. So you have so many in Division I athletics, public schools that are governed by state statutes in terms of collective bargaining and labor relations. That is a huge telltale sign of pretty much everybody concluded these were employees, and you were probably going to have to declare that. You found a way to not say that out loud and kick this issue away from the National Labor Relations Board. But that to me was the first real indication of it's going to be hard to continue to say these are not employees, these are students that happen to be joining an organization. So
I often hear that, the president, he's had golf with Greg Sankey the other day, or like, is there anything that can be, and not making an argument one way or another, is there anything that can stop this, do you think, down in the crystal ball next 10 years?
Yeah.
Is there anything that can stop the professionalization of this, to make it officially, not the facade that we've been doing? Is anything that can stop this snowball going down?
It will take an act of Congress. It will take, an act of Congress and maybe even an act of Congress mirrored by state legislatures, again, because of the federalism issue here, right? That you have so many of these institutions that are state institutions that are kind of outside the federal influence. But at the end of the day, I just think we have one system that really works. We know how it works. It's well defined. To have us in a predictable model for the long-term future it kind of has to be that collective bargaining agreement system to do it. And I know that's like nails on a chalkboard to so many people that are going to be listening to this saying, oh, no, we don't want it to be that. Then we kind of needed to prevent that from happening in about 1995.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't it? I mean, you're very well versed in this. I know enough to be dangerous. Was it 85 in that Supreme Court case that really was the turning point with all this? With I think it was Oklahoma and the TV rights and all that stuff.
Yep, broadcast rights and who gets to do what, and again, big money gets in the way of the system, and that's really the first big domino that fell here. And the next one was the EA Sports, just because it was so blatant for individual athletes to be licensed essentially without any compensation. And that was where you just had the general public aha moment of, this doesn't feel right. Okay, I don't have the name of that player, but you have every single identifying characteristic of that player being sent out and licensed, and I'm paying money for this product because of how specific it replicates that player. Those are, to me, the two things that really took us well beyond, to the point of no return on more professionalized versus amateur student athlete competition.
So this House settlement, it caps these schools at $20.5 million, and there's the athlete back pay and all this. But then there's already all these loopholes like, well, this player gets to deal with Nike or, you know, and there's going to be this clearinghouse, which I think this clearinghouse, like, I feel bad, Nate, because I don't want to just crap all over it before they've had a chance. Because most of the people trying to clean this up didn't make these decisions in 1980 that got us here. So I try and give them some grace. I really do. But the idea that this clearinghouse is going to monitor every NIL deal in the country and just give it a stamp of approval or deny, like, this seems insane to me. I don't know how this could possibly work.
And again, it's all fake and artificial anyway. We're pretending like those deals aren't in effect pay to play. Nobody wants to use those terms, but the reality is we have coaches out there who are going to be saying, here's how much money we can get you to play for our team, right? Like that is what's going to continue to happen. And so, okay, we don't want to call it pay for play, but at the end of the day, it's cleaner and better to have sunshine on it and run it as, okay, you're actually being paid by this institution, this dollar amount. They're going to have the boosters raise the money to fill that. But we're going to take out all the other artificial pieces to this equation, and we're going to regulate it. And frankly, it's probably going to end up with a better sustainable model to do that. Everything else is just trying to refuse to accept the reality of what is actually happening in college athletics.
And I find it hard to believe that, like, legally. So if you're let's say you're a middle relief pitcher for the Kansas City Royals, you probably don't have any endorsement deals.
Right.
I mean, I doubt Fabletics and Nike are knocking down your door.
You got to have a pretty funky hat or something going on that makes you attractive to marketing, right?
But if you're, the ace pitcher or you're Bobby Witt, right? Like, you probably got 3 or 4. Like, this is just how the world works. So, like, I just don't know how you can go to, like, a college athlete. Well, we own your name, image, and likeness. The institution does because you're getting this paycheck. Now you can't take if Robinhood wants to give you an NIL deal, you're just not going to be able to do it. Now, that's not the House settlement. That's not how it's set up. But I know people who think, like, no, you're signing everything over to us. Like, that's not even how it works in the pros, like in this deal.
Correct.
If the relief pitcher wants to get an endorsement deal with Bud Light, he can.
Right. And that's part of that collective bargaining agreement. Could you do that? Could you go so far as to say you can't have endorsement deals outside of the Major League Baseball relationship? Sure, you could negotiate that term in your collective bargaining agreement, but no one will, because nobody wants to do that, because all the players like the ability to have their own control over that. And the owners don't really care whether they, you get to get an extra ad from Tide because your hat is super dirty and once a year you clean it, or those kind of quirky things that are you do. Like, that even helps that baseball team promote itself. So like they want you to be able to do that. Trying to have, again, all these artificial controls, setting up all these weird guidelines around what athletes can and can't do to try and continue to call them student athletes, not employees. It doesn't get us there. And so that student athlete who is denied a right to do something is going to eventually walk into court and say, why is it that I can't have X, Y, and Z? And the court's going to say, well, there was this other settlement a few years ago, but things have changed since that settlement was done. And this is the new system and new reality. I don't think you should be restricted from that. And so now we've got a new settlement that's going to have to be worked out for whatever loophole has been exploited that will end up being very unfair to a group of college athletes who are going to complain about it. And they're going to say, we weren't factored into this decision and we're being told to follow these rules. We don't like that. And so that's just going to continue to be that moving target that we will see through every cycle until eventually, yes, we have a true collective bargaining agreement that tells us, again, how people are compensated, what they can be compensated, what's included in allowable compensation, all those factors with the permission consent of both sides. It's a collective agreement between the two sides. That's the only gold standard we know of to do this right. And again, there are going to be people that are going to say, absolutely not, we can't have them. These aren't professional sports. They really are. We know they are.
The other side of this, for the sake of balance in this conversation, because I've talked with people on the school side. Mm-hmm. There's a marketing part, like the media guy in me who does resent it when we call it like name, image, and likeness, like, because there's a lot of these players that are making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. If they walk into the grocery store, nobody knows who they are. Right. Like, there's not, in the schools will say, well, the only reason they know who they are is because they play for Iowa or they play for Iowa State. And it's a lawn. In many cases, they're not wrong. Right. Like the market value for a strict name, image, and likeness is insane because it's the farce that we have identified it to be. Right. Where it's like their pay per play value is considerably higher. Like, so that's the other side of this to me. It's like, we have to quit in this thing going forward, quit calling it NIL. Like it was offensive to me that they launched this clearinghouse called NIL Go, because it's like, it's not what it is. Like, I don't know. Like that. So that part of, like, I do agree with the schools and that's it. But I could also make the argument, Nate, that the reason the brand of these schools and athletic institutions is what it is, it's been built up off of people who did that work for free and weren't compensated for it for the last 50 years. And
when you watch that system go to the kind of really disproportional result that we had for a while, where all the money was trapped in coaches' salaries and facilities, you ended up with really unfair. A coach could restrict your transfer from their school to anybody in the conference, anybody on the schedule for the next 3 years, and anybody on the schedule with those people for the next 3 years from being immediately available to play. Right? You had the coach be in a position to do that, and after the coach being in the position to do that, but also be in the position to say, I'm not coming back next season. See ya. And I'm going to get a signing bonus to go do that. And I'm going to get, $3 million a year on top of that. You guys are going to do this for free. And I'm actually telling you where you can't go to college next year to boot. Like that was so disproportionate. But that's what you get when you have one part of this big money system that is frozen out from any of the money. You end up with that group being wholly and totally voiceless. And as a result, getting a system that has them essentially taking what they get and not being able to do anything about it.
What is your, intellectual response to the crowd? And I guarantee there's thousands of them listening right now who, they get the scholarship and they get the room and board and they like that. That's real value. And it is. How do you respond to those folks? Yeah,
that is real value. And if that was enough, then why don't we just pay the coaches that way too? We'll give them an off-campus, on-campus housing setup. They'll get free board, and we'll do this all amateur. That doesn't make sense to people because it's never worked that way, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing when you talk about these student athletes, to say, well, you get enough because you're getting your scholarship. Well, okay, but a lot of other people on campus are getting scholarship, and they can get paid for other things too. If I'm a really good, high aptitude student that, in the music program cuts an album, I can go out and make a bunch of money from the album that I've cut and still get my free room and board and scholarship. But magically, because I'm in athletics, I can't do that. Now, there's not a lot of that going on out there, right? I'm not trying to say that there's a bunch of students that are getting that. But you are telling this group of students they have lesser and fewer rights than everybody else on campus because they're doing the thing that brings in a whole bunch of money to the campus. And so that's never been a fair argument to say, well, you're getting enough, because that's not how any of the rest of the free market works, right? We don't say, well, because you're a mechanic, you should only get X amount of housing allowance and X. That's not how any of this has ever worked. And that only makes sense to you if you are wedded to this amateur model of athletics that you've just always been taught is the way it has to be. If you take that kind of historical context away, this system makes absolutely no sense to go back to something like that.
There's really no system like this anywhere else in the world, is there?
No, which is why it has not stood up to scrutiny for. Yeah, I mean,
you look at like European soccer and like all these, like, that you may be able to compare, even like European basketball, where they start playing professionally like 18 usually. Like nothing set up like this. It's mind-boggling. I had two other topics for you. I wanted to ask about the whole the fundamental idea of a super league and like the legalities of that. Mm-hmm. And two, I want to hit on the sports gambling tax that's been going around the country. It's a big talker right now, going to these athletic departments. I'll start with their SEC Media Day. I don't know how much you actually follow this on a day-to-day basis, but this has been kicked around for a really long time, where eventually the haves and the have-nots completely separate. But it's looking a little more damning now, like with some threats that are coming out of like one of these anonymous SEC athletic directors throughout last week that the Big Ten and the SEC should just completely break away from every other conference and do their own thing. And then you've got like this posturing where they don't want to be looked at as the bad guy. Is that legal? Like because there's always like, oh, everybody's going to get sued.
Yeah.
What? Because I get it. Like, you can't treat Drake football like you treat Alabama football. Like, I understand it.
Right.
If all of a sudden the SEC and the Big Ten are like, we're going to take our top 10 programs from each league, we're going to kick everybody else out, go do our own thing. Is that legal? Can they do that if they wanted to?
I'm going to give you the best lawyer answer ever.
Okay.
Maybe.
All right.
and that's the reality, because it depends on how much control they actually end up being able to exert, because it is unfair restraint on trade for one part of a market to exert that much influence and authority over the rest of the market, right? Yeah. So no, technically you can't do that. But technically it's also illegal. We have a tort of intentional interference with existing contractual relations. Technically it's illegal for Conference A to call a school in Conference B and say, hey, if you leave, we'd love to have you. You're inducing them to breach their contract to come join your league. But nobody really wants to press that button, because Conference B is going to immediately do the same thing to Conference C to go get its school to replace it. So
they all have.
Correct. And so technically those things are probably illegal, but they're also the industry standard. And so those two things are going to be, jarring up against each other to try and figure out, all right, what's going to be the outcome that is legal and allowable. And we get very close to pressing a red button that nobody wants to see what it actually sets off to do it. So I think it's a lot of posturing by the SEC to just try and say, hey, you guys all have to really listen to us. Otherwise, we'll go do this thing that nobody wants to see us do. We don't want to do it either. So why don't you guys just agree to do the thing we want you to do? And the power conferences have been able to do that pretty regularly since the 1980s, which again gets us back to the original part of the conversation. That's why we're in this situation.
Yeah.
The power conferences had the ability to do these things, and everybody else kind of got drug along for the ride. And now you have a bunch of people trying to clean up a mess from people that made really big money decisions that benefited themselves all along the way.
Really all to do with television. I mean, if you think about the first real realignment moves, which was Penn State to the Big Ten, and then when the Big 12 formed, because the Southwest Conference had all of its issues, and the Big 8 was really struggling financially because it didn't have enough television eyeballs. So they went and got the tech, and then the whole thing just explodes. Right.
And then it ended up almost being the undoing of the Big 12 just a few years later for the same exact reason.
The other one is, and I'm really interested to see where this goes, because I think I could be persuaded a couple of different ways. I'm learning more about it, but I know you're in the mix when the sports gambling thing was happening, however many years ago. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it 7 or 8 years ago, 9 years ago, whatever.
Probably 6-7 years ago, something like that.
So we have a really low gambling tax in our state compared to the rest of the country. And we're seeing North Carolina is basically going to raise its sports gambling tax, and the state's going to give money to the athletic departments with some conditions that they have to play non-conference basketball games and this type of thing. Saw it today. Illinois is doing something similar. We don't know exactly where that money is going that I've seen yet, but they are raising their gambling tax and whatever. I think I could make a really strong argument that we absolutely should consider this in this state, because our professional sports are Iowa and Iowa State. Yeah. And they have a massive economic value to the state of Iowa. If a super league ever formed, it's not a guarantee that the University of Iowa would be in it, contrary to what a lot of their fans think. Iowa State most certainly would not be in it. Right. And that would be I think a major economic catastrophe for our state to not be competitive because we don't have other sports. Right. The other thing is just, should we be jacking around with that with these athletic departments, right? Like, it took them so long. I remember I started covering Iowa State in 2004, and it was the big thing to get independent of the state so we can be a self-funding athletic department. And now it's like, well, we have all these costs that we didn't anticipate. And then where do you stand on this? Should we be doing this? And this is just the gambling tax, but in other states, Tennessee, they're screwing around like anybody can. The governor can just give them money from all I know down there. So where do you stand on the state's funding athletic departments, and how does this work?
First things first, gambling issues are always fascinating because they along with everything else in college athletics, they don't neatly fit along the party lines, right? You have very conservative people that for their Christian religious background say absolutely not. I will not support any form of gambling anyway. No way, no how. You also have people on the other end of the spectrum on the Democratic side who feel like it's a regressive tax and that it exploits people in ways that put stress on the rest of the system for gambling assistance. And so you have people in both parties that are wholly opposed to gambling in various forms or all forms. You have people in the middle on both sides who, will have the ability to say, okay, certain amount of gambling is if it's regulated the right way, can be beneficial to the economy and look at it fairly objectively. So whenever an issue like this comes up, it's a really weird coalition of politicians that have to get it through the finish line. And so when you start talking about how you spend the gambling money, you get into that same exact question of, okay, but if we're saying it's okay to tax it, we're saying it's okay to gamble. So we're back to the original, problems of who's going to be able to vote for it and against it. So that's part one of the equation. Then part two is, all right, when there's a lot of money coming in or could be coming in through gambling revenue for the state, the state's going to look at that and say, well, that's a really easy source of revenue that isn't the same as overall raising taxes in other formats, right? People hate tax increases, right? They always will. And so when you see something like a user fee or a way to avoid taxing, you see politicians kind of gravitate to that solution because it's not the same as just raising income tax. So you look at this and say, all right, there's a lot more money than anybody thought was going to be coming through sports gambling. And people thought a lot of money was going to come through it. It's a lot more than people anticipated. So now you have this, the state looking at this saying, all right, if we like North Carolina has tried to do, say that a portion of these proceeds is going to go back into college athletics, that makes it a little more palatable for the sports gamblers who are saying, well, you just raise taxes on me, but you're supporting something that I am betting on, so I like the outcome. So maybe it's not so bad. But the state's always going to have the temptation to say, but we're not going to give all the proceeds to that because we have other things that we want to fund. So they're going to figure out, okay, is it an 80-20 split or whatever it is? Or is it, like Illinois seems to be proposing, we're just going to bring more money in the general fund and do whatever we want with it because gambling is giving us the opportunity to do things. That's really hard to control because gambling tends to be a little bit influenced by how good the economy is, right? People spend more money when the economy's good, less money when the economy's down. Sometimes it can have an inverse relationship to the economy. People can gamble more when they're desperate, trying to. So it's kind of a weird existence that's out there of how it's influenced. But the point is, it's not really a steady revenue stream. So you don't want to fund things that are really dependent on steady revenue with gambling. So it kind of can make sense to say, all right, college athletics seems like a place that can go up and down and weather that storm better than like K-12 education, right? We can't really go way up and down on the funding based on gambling revenues. So that's why that temptation is there. But to your point, in a state like Iowa, there are not a lot of ways for us to keep up with the big money colleges. And so is this something that could make sense? I think it's got to be looked at very carefully for how it impacts other things to get there. But if other states are going to do it and University of Iowa and Iowa State are looking at, can they even survive in this system? They're going to put lots of pressure on legislators to say, all right, if it's good for North Carolina, it's got to be good for us.
I know, and I have to fight this. I look at everything through a sports lens because that's what I do.
Yeah.
But I get a lot of pushback when I talk about this. People are like, oh, well, this is how we fund para educators. And it's like, well, can't we fund them, like still fund them? Like just because the athletic departments are going to get a little bit of help. And I don't have a lot of sympathy for athletic departments either. That's the thing. Like I'm not like this.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just not. But I also I see it firsthand, specifically up in Ames on Saturdays. That would be a really tough deal for that town.
Yes.
If all of a sudden Iowa State football was playing in FCS.
Right.
Like we're seeing it in Pullman, Washington right now, and they didn't even drop down to that. But
right.
That is a reality. That could happen.
Yes.
The University of Iowa could no longer be in the Big Ten in 10 years. It is possible. No, it's not fear mongering. Like this is just the reality. If we're going to this professional thing here.
Going back to what almost happened with the Big 12, what was it, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
When that conference was ready to implode. And it was, Iowa State and Kansas were looking around like, where are we going to end up? And it was as obvious as it could be made that your population dictates the number of eyeballs on your football team on television, not how you pack a stadium. And that is what gives value to the people that are looking to make really big money off of your sports program.
So like when you guys are sitting in the Senate and you're having this conversation, because I get it all the time, like, oh, well, those people have way more important things to worry about. Mm-hmm. I'm not denying that. You're doing a lot of serious work. I think it's serious work, though, to not lose, like, I don't know this. I would guess when it comes to straight tourism in our state, is there many drivers big other than the state fair? that are bigger than Iowa and Iowa State football?
Right. No, you cannot ignore the economic impact in not just Ames and Iowa City, but, you mentioned FCS Northern Iowa, right? There are plenty of people that go to and pay attention to division, FCF Division 1AA football, right? Look at what would happen in South Dakota and North Dakota, right? If all of a sudden, those
great point
tectonic plates shift, that's a huge driver of their, tourism and economy type thing. So no, these are major businesses that exist in our communities. And yeah, they are worthy of attention. And especially when we talk about sports gambling, that's a lot of money going to different places potentially. It's very much worthy of attention from the legislature.
Well, I know there's unintended consequences to everything, and which is kind of why we're all in the position that we are. I truly don't think that most of these suits sitting around in 1991 had evil intentions, and they just didn't see these plates shifting like they were. I do think there were some bad actors along the years, no doubt.
Yes,
but here we are, and we got to have some good leadership to get us out of this. So I really appreciate it, and I hope you don't mind. Now that I have your number, I might bother you a little more.
Anytime, happy to talk about this stuff. But to your point, I don't think there were a lot of truly trying to break the system bad actors, but money leads people to make some questionable decisions for the benefit of yourself versus others.
Yeah,
and those gains were made substantially for yourself at the time, with really serious consequences for us to unpack now.
And the other harsh reality too, that I hate to think about, but I think we have to talk about, is a lot of the recipients of these scholarships and are from poor families, right? From underrepresented communities. And we're kind of coming at them with take it or leave it with that mentality. And they had to take it.
Yes. And going back to the original name, image, likeness discussions, you're exactly right. We're talking about generational wealth, right? Life-changing money that was frozen away from people for 4 or 5 years during their athletic careers, where the institution brought in a bunch of money for their athletic performances. And you have several situations where someone suffered a career-ending injury in that senior year or their first year in the NFL, and all of that value was gone. And that's the reality of what we're talking about here is, these are athletes that could have and should have made hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in the 90s and 2000s. They were told they absolutely couldn't, but don't worry, wait until you become a professional and it's going to be there. There's no guarantee that that's going to actually materialize. And so, it's tough to say, well, this system worked better before, because there were definitely losers in that system that really were unfairly put in that category.
Nate, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, anytime.
Good conversation right there. That was fun. I could have talked to Nate Boulton for hours about all this stuff because I'm a total geek about it. And it's just a really fascinating time where we're at in college athletics. I hope you guys all learned something from it. I hope you can take something from it. And I hope we're all more educated about the topic going forward. Thanks to Nate. Thanks to our friends at Steeple Ridge Bourbon and the Lonely Oak Distillery for sponsoring the CW Pod here on Iowa Everywhere.